Hi, I'm Gail Sokol, and on today's show, we will discuss how to create your very own sourdough starter, part 3 of my 4-part series on sourdoughs.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
On today's show, we will discuss how to create your very own sourdough starter. It's very exciting. So let's review just a little bit. In my introduction to sourdough starters, which was part 1 of the 4-part series, we talked about how yeasted doughs, known as pre-ferments, provide superb flavor to bread, unlike any other bread you could make. And of the 2 types of pre-ferments that I discussed, sponges and sourdoughs, the sourdough is the premium pre-ferment that keeps on going. Remember, I have 3 starters as we speak that are at least 20 years old living in my refrigerator. Sourdoughs do not get used up like most sponges do. If you recall, a sponge is made ahead of time with some flour, water, and usually some commercial yeast, and allowed to ferment for several hours before adding more ingredients to it and then making a bread dough out of that. The entire sponge gets baked into the bread and there is no more left. Nada. It's done. But a sourdough is different in that you only use a small part of it at a time, and it can live on basically indefinitely if it's fed regularly. And the sourdough starter can be created from wild yeast that exists in the air all around your home and kitchen, if you're lucky. That sounds ominous, doesn't it? So let's create a sourdough starter together. If you look on the internet, there are oodles of recipes for sourdough starters that begin with very small amounts of flour and water. Perhaps they're trying to not waste too many ingredients in case the process doesn't work. I don't know. But they look very tiny, like a 7th grade science experiment. I begin my starters with a bit more flour and a little more water and some assurance that the process will stand the best chance of creating the healthiest of starters. It is important to say before I get started on how to actually help you create your very own natural sourdough starter that there are no guarantees at success. I sound like a commercial. I recall reading a recipe in a very well-known baking instructor's cookbook who, when he gave his recipe for a sourdough starter, stated in writing, in a disclaimer, that he could not guarantee success, that the reader would have a viable starter at the end. But let's be optimistic. I have never had a starter that I have begun that has not worked. So before we actually begin to make the starter, let's talk about flour. Flour is very important. What flour is the best one to get started? And there's a little bit of, discussion about it, shall we say. Some bakers begin their starters with some rye flour because rye contains less gluten-forming proteins and it may be easier to maintain. At least that's the thought. You can also make starters with gluten-free flours, so almost any grain flour will work. I have begun my starters with a high-protein flour, like unbleached white bread flour, and I have had great success. I did have a rye starter and a whole wheat starter, but I actually like the taste of my 3 white bread starters the best. And I can always add whole wheat or rye to them as I make different types of breads. And I do add other things to my bread doughs like grains or seeds to create different textures and tastes when I bake. That's what makes the bread interesting. But I feel the white bread flour is a nice canvas to start with. Remember, it's just my opinion. It is important to note that many recipes for sourdough starters add some commercial yeast to them at the beginning, just to ensure success, a little bit of guarantee. I explained this on a previous show on the science of sourdoughs. The thought is that as the fermentation process continues, wild yeast will overtake the commercial yeast, and the starter will become all wild after a while. But commercial yeast is not a necessity. I have never used it to begin a starter. To begin a natural sourdough starter, there's usually a 1-to-1 ratio of flour to water. Basically, all you need to create a starter is 2 ingredients, and that's the flour and the water. But again, this is not a sure thing. Some bakers take advantage of the wild yeast from fruits, like organic grapes or apples, or even certain starchy vegetables like potatoes that are used as attractants to attract the wild yeast, like a siren, right? Attracting them to come and live in your starter. I actually added an attractant to my water so the wild yeast would come. I boiled a potato in water, and I used the cooled water, which is nice and starchy, to attract the yeast. So those starches break down into chains of sugar, and they actually fed the yeast. And it worked. It also creates a wonderful starter, and it also helps if you are an active baker in your kitchen. The act of frequent baking actually attracts wild yeast. Remember that movie Field of Dreams? Build it and they will come. Well, I say bake it and they will come. So if you bake a lot, those yeast will come. All right, you ready? This is how to create your very own sourdough starter. And remember, you only need to do this once, never again if you play your cards right. This is my potato sourdough starter, from me to you. So first thing, you are going to begin with a scrupulously clean 2-gallon plastic container. That's about 7.5 liter capacity. It's not that big. It sounds bigger than it really is. You want to actually use a safe plastic like BPA free. You want to bring 3.5 cups of water, or about 28 fluid ounces of water, and 1 medium cubed unpeeled potato to a boil in a saucepan. And you want to boil this for 12 to 15 minutes or until the potato chunks are fork tender. So stick a fork in them. If it goes in easily, they're done. You want to allow the mixture to cool and get really cool. 78 degrees is where I want you to bring it. And when you feel 78 degrees Fahrenheit, that's pretty cool. You want to measure out 2 cups of that potato water and save the potato for another use. Mash it, give it to your dog, whatever you want to do with it. Discard the remaining water. So you're basically saving only 2 cups. So why did I start with so much water? Well, it evaporates, and I want to make sure we had enough. In the clean 2-gallon container, you want to mix together the 2 cups of the potato water, 1 3/4 cups of unbleached white bread flour, and a teaspoon of granulated sugar, a little bit of food, a little bit of sugar for the yeast. And you want to use a wooden spoon and blend it all together. Cover the container with plastic wrap and secure it with a large rubber band. Now, I know some of these large plastic containers have covers already. Don't use the cover. I made the mistake of using a cover for one of my starters, and it literally exploded off almost every night, because once you start building up carbon dioxide, which is part of the fermentation process, you'll never be able to keep that cover on. Plastic wrap can balloon out a little bit. It's sort of cool. So use plastic wrap, clean plastic wrap. Now, let it sit out at cool room temperature, which is about 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, for 24 hours. Stir the starter once every day, allowing it to sit for 3 days. All right, so now we're going to be going on to day 4. Now you're going to observe it. You're going to watch it. You're going to see what it does. It may not be pretty. I don't want you to get scared. It may smell and look very strange. On day 4, the starter will become quite sour in smell and start to separate. The sour smell is actually from the bacteria that are beginning to outnumber the yeast. Do not do what I did when I first made my first starter. I threw it out. I actually saw it and I said, ooh, this is ugly. Something bad and evil's happening. I messed up and I chucked it. I actually threw it out. And when I did it again, it did the exact same thing again. So I was doing it right. It's ugly. Just don't give up. Okay, be brave, be strong. So on day 4, you're going to start feeding the starter. You're going to start giving it 1 1/4 cups of white unbleached bread flour and 2 cups of 78-degree Fahrenheit water. So that's pretty cool water. You're going to stir it well. This feeding, you're actually feeding, the flour is food for that yeast, and it's going to feed it and provide a stimulus for the wild yeast to multiply and actually bring the bacteria numbers down, so the smell will get a lot better. Allow the starter to sit at cool room temperature for 4 more days. No stirring. All right, no stirring. You may notice bubbles appearing. The great news is that the yeast are actively undergoing fermentation, especially if you see bubbles, you can almost guarantee that's happening. And they're surviving quite nicely alongside their friend, bacteria. And they each eat different sugars within the starter, which is great news. They can live off each other symbiotically. It's a beautiful thing. On day 9, you're going to begin a regular feeding schedule of 3 feedings a day. Remember I told you it's like having a baby? Very similar. And you're going to feed approximately every 4 to 6 hours. And you can be a little loose with it too. Sometimes I've fed every 8 hours, every 5 hours. You can be a little loosey-goosey. But in the beginning, you want to feed 3 times a day. After the 3rd feeding, the starter is covered and left to sit overnight. The feeding should consist of 1 cup of cool 78-degree Fahrenheit water, remember that is cool, and 1 1/4 cups of white unbleached bread flour. I use tap water, but if you don't like the water that you have, it's too hard, you can use bottled water or bottled spring water, that's up to you. And I usually give my baby, or I'm sorry, my starter, but it really is like a baby. I usually give it the first feeding sometime in the morning when I first wake up, the second one in the late afternoon, and the last one 4 to 6 hours after that, usually before I go to bed sometime. Every morning you will notice lots of bubbles if your starter is alive and well, and give it a chance. You want to make sure you feed the starter for 3 days until day 11, 3 times a day until day 11. Remember that. So through day 11. On day 12, guess what? You can bake with your starter. It's important to note that you're going to get the best results out of your starter if you bake with it between 12 and 15 hours after its last feeding. So it should still be bubbly and not peter out before you use it. You'll notice when it actually starts puffing up and getting a little bit larger in volume. That's why you have such a large container to begin with. It allows not only carbon dioxide to fill the remainder of the container, but your starter's going to grow and go down and go up and go down. It's a living thing, okay? So have some respect. All right, so here are some tips to get the best sourdough starter ever. Tip number 1, after day 12, stir that starter and discard all but 2 cups every morning, all right? Once you wake up in the morning, you don't want to keep feeding that starter every single day. You're going to end up with a house full of starter. And there was a movie about that many years ago called The Blob. So you don't want that again. So before its first feeding, throw out everything but 2 cups. And I clean out that plastic container before I add the starter back into the container for its first feeding. Make sure everything is scrupulously clean. We're only inviting healthy bacteria. We don't want the bad stuff. Tip 2, when I feed the starter, I sometimes add a little bit more flour in case I'm late in making a feeding. And so for every 2 cups of starter, I feed it 1 1/4 cups of that white bread flour instead of just 1 cup, and 1 cup of water. It should be 1-to-1 water and flour, but that little extra 1/4 cup of flour keeps it going for a little bit longer if I'm late. Tip number 3, I want you to remember as you begin baking with your starter, your first loaf of bread will be good, but as you bake with it time and time again, it will get better and better and better. This is because the starter gets more developed, tastes are more complex, and it's developing flavorful organic compounds that are developing, and it takes time, like a good wine, to develop over and over again. Now, last but not least, when you want to give yourself a break, you can actually place 2 cups of your starter in a clean airtight container, non-reactive, safe plastic with a container top if you want, and store it in your fridge for a few weeks. It will lie dormant. It will sort of go to sleep. Just be sure to date it and label it and try to use it every couple of months. You can even give, as you're growing your starter, you could even give a couple of cups to your friends or neighbors. They may come to hate you for it, but you know what? I don't give my starter away to anybody. I'm really selfish because it's really an award-winning starter and I love it. So if you want to make one, but you are really ready to begin. The biggest thing when you're baking, you get all excited that you're baking your bread. Oh boy, I'm breaking my first loaf of bread. Don't forget to save 2 cups of that starter or you'll have to do this whole 14-day thing again. And it's not pretty. So you want to do it once, get it done, and then have it for years and years. So for the exact instructions in writing on how to make this wild sourdough starter, go to my website, chefgailsokol.com. Thank you so much for listening. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, my YouTube channel, and my website, chefgailsokol.com. On the next show, we'll be making focaccia with your new sourdough starter, part 4 of my sourdough series.